And our next speaker is Dr. Kala Fleming, and she is the CEO of Frontline Gig, and she is supporting in working to democratize green jobs and connect untapped talent to the green economy. And hello, Dr. Kala. She's going to speak with us about, does more climate tech equal more equity?
Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm glad I came early enough to catch the previous talk with Agilent. So by background, I have lab experience. I'm a chemistry undergrad, and then for grad school, I did civil and environmental engineering. And I don't know if you can admit that when I worked in the lab, and the reason that I switched from chemistry to civil engineering is that I got a couple whiffs of chloroform, and I thought, maybe not. But in grad school, I did still work with, mass specs because a lot of my work focused on looking at natural organic material in drinking water systems and thinking about chlorine and the reactions to, develop cancer-causing substances. So big total flashback. And then also, in a former life, I was a sustainability manager. So a lot of the issues that you guys are thinking through around sustainability and the trade-offs, I had to think about that as well. So maybe then just to orient you, so the talk today will be more focused on what happens outside of the building envelope or even the campus. There are similar conversations about choices and trade-offs that are happening around climate. And I want to give you a little bit of insight and perspective on that as you're embarking on your sustainability journey. So to get started, I want to have maybe just a little game where you're going to imagine a couple of things. So the first thing I want you to think about is something like a neighborhood microgarden. I don't know what that might spark for you, but think about, it could be as simple as the green space around that tree on the sidewalk. So think about the plants that are contained in that, right? So whatever your imagination leads you to think about. Then think about also like a rack of EV charging stations that you might find in a city parking lot. That's sort of the second infrastructure visual. And the third, on a beautiful day like this, think just more simply about a bench in a park. Who's sitting on it? Are you on it instead of being inside of this room? So I bring those three things up, and let's see if we can get this to work. I bring those three examples of infrastructure up because they represent just three of the more than 50 million pieces of newer, smaller green infrastructure that will need to be installed across our communities to slow down the processes that are causing our climate to change. And the 50 million pieces comes from when you look at all of the heat pumps that need to be installed, all of the individual charging stations. So with the work that I do now at Frontline Gig, a lot of the thinking and the conversation is about, well, who's going to do that work? Who's going to do the installation? Who's going to do the maintenance? And so 3 years ago, when I thought about that and I played a similar game, I envisioned a whole new green workforce, one that would prioritize the men and women who are interested in this space. Maybe they don't care about climate, but they are interested to have more meaningful jobs and make more money and be on the upside of this current conversation that we're having. And so climate is a $3 trillion opportunity when we look at the federal investments and all of the changes that companies are going to make. And the question is, who are the winners and the losers as a part of that conversation as we look towards securing a more resilient, sustainable future. So the work that we do with Frontline Gig is that we have a workforce development platform that enables this new climate workforce that we dreamed up. And so the idea is that for all of this new infrastructure that needs to be installed, a lot of the talent don't even have the skills yet because they don't even know that they are relevant to the solution. So maybe they're driving Uber, and I don't think there's anything wrong with Uber in general, but the question is, what kinds of options and opportunities can you give individuals? So what we did is that we combined the positive side of the gig economy is that it's flexible, it's easy, it's low commitment. And so for the new generation of talent that we're looking to include to do some of the maintenance and the installation and even the inspections work, we're saying, come over here, try it. What tends to happen is that for jobs that look like blue collar, and even that definition is blurring, but it means you're mostly working outside, it tends to be that there isn't the same amount of choice and flexibility about career paths and options. So with your current roles right now, as I guess you have different roles within the lab, I'm assuming that many of you got to think a lot about, do I want to do this or not? And I don't know, I'm assuming you got to really think about whether you wanted to commit to this particular career path. And oftentimes, and essentially, if you weren't doing this, I don't know how many of you would have been YouTube creators or something else, but the point is, I think a lot of you had choice and options. What we see today is that for many of the blue collar talent, and in general for the skilled trades, it's an aging field because a lot of the newer talent, they have distractions. If you can talk enough and have the gift of gab and you look half decent and presentable, you can go on YouTube and make 100K, right? And be entertaining. And so even for many of the traditional utilities, they're having to contend with that reality, right? That my competition isn't just another company in the adjacent space, it's all of the new technology that's coming up and coming on board. So with our platform, we allow talent that didn't even know that they could, so imagine your Uber driver, and we say to them, hey, come over here, get paid for 2 hours at a time, learn about environmental restoration, or literally just do a paid park cleanup. If you like it and you keep coming back, and we assess your behavioral profile, and we think that, oh, maybe it's a match. And then if you like the vibe and you think, I think I like this, then there's a progression path for you to do more work with us or to be connected to like a community college or another kind of training organization that would allow you to discover your career path. Or maybe there are entry-level jobs that are connected to climate that you didn't know about. But that's what we do. And so far, a lot of it is working. We have more than 1,000 individuals. So we're a startup. And so there are more than 1,000 individuals that we've been able to reach who are like, we're interested in green jobs. We want to know more. It's still early days for us. Our goal is to be in the millions. And then in terms of employer and training partners, we have about 100 right now who are either signed up with us or in the pipelines. So I wanted to give you an example of untapped talent, what that looks like. So I came in today from, I'm in Baltimore. I'm on the East Coast, Baltimore, DC, Virginia. And so Darnell is a young man in DC. So we do work across those 3 states right now with our different partners. And so Darnell lives on the outskirts of DC, does a lot of freelancing kind of work. And so like some on our platform, he saw an ad and that's how he got started with Frontline. And so ultimately for his story is that he came to the first 2-hour gig, came back a couple more times, and then that made, because of the assessments that we're doing, that made him eligible for paid training that got him learning more about green stormwater infrastructure. And since then, he's become a crew lead with more stable work, supporting green stormwater infrastructure maintenance kinds of projects. He's also heading to community college next month to start a horticulture program. He didn't know what horticulture was because that just wasn't a thing that was presented to him. And longer term, he wants to run his own business. And so for our story around just this startup and what we want to do, and for the raise that we have and everything else, it's to create many more Darnells who are able to be a part of this conversation that we're having right now. So I wanted to then mention, so I think you have a sense then from the Darnell story, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with green stormwater infrastructure. Everybody clear on what that roughly is? Just by a show of hands? Oh, okay. So let me explain. So to keep it really simple, I don't know if you can see what's happening on the sidewalk. So this is a sidewalk, and Rebecca is one of our partners, but this is in DC. So it's kind of winter, so this is not as green as you might want it to be. But basically, this is a green sidewalk here. And so the plants that are installed here are meant to help capture some of the runoff that's coming as when it rains. And that ultimately helps to reduce flooding, because if you can soak more water in where it's raining, then it means less of it is going to run off onto the road. And so within stormwater management, one of the big things that's changing is that many more cities have a lot more of this green stormwater infrastructure. And so on the one hand, it's good because it helps them delay the infrastructure costs for concrete. And it's just, it's one of those shifts, but it's a garden. And the typical public works department employee, they know how to push mowers. They don't do gardening. Entirely different skill set. And so back to that whole idea of the newer, smaller infrastructure, this is an example of it. And so even for the start of a frontline, the simple question we were asking is, who's going to do that? It's great that you can maybe get the adoption and get a municipality to start putting more of this infrastructure in, but once it's in, who's going to weed it? Who's going to understand what's an invasive plant versus a beneficial plant? Who's doing that? And it turns out when we had discussions across the country, so we didn't talk to anybody in San Diego, but we did talk to San Francisco, LA, New York. So some of the cities that I think are the bastions of embracing this technology, they struggle with maintenance for a range of reasons. Some of it is, nuances of capital funding allocations versus operations and maintenance budgets. But another big piece of it is simply, it's more labor intensive. And so in one of the discussions we had, I think it was in Philadelphia, and that particular stormwater manager, Yale grad, we're talking very advanced and sophisticated, but he was like, you know what I need? We're talking about a range of solutions and different ways to help him solve this maintenance challenge. And he was like, listen, that company, that Roto-Rooter company, why don't we have something like that, right? Where it's easy to find people who I can slot in to do maintenance, because the alternative is that you have a full-scale contractor who is very niche. Not a lot of people know how to do the maintenance. And he was like, my problem right now is that they keep coming back and raising the cost of this service every month. So anyways, all of that to say, we can see that with green stormwater infrastructure, there's an immediate benefit for flooding reduction. There's a workforce component, but also there's in terms of the climate conversation, once you have vegetation that's growing, that's a carbon scrubber, right? But it's one that's very localized. And so what's interesting is that with this kind of local infrastructure that you install, and that's, if you've heard nature-based being used as a term, that's exactly what this is an example of. It's one of the things that helps with, to offset emissions. And so in the study that was done, and that's what I'm sort of citing here, in the Chicago metro area, they found that given, if you look at the density of emissions from the cars that are in that metro area, they looked at their green infrastructure footprint. And roughly what they found is, and there are lots of nuances that we can go into, but because of the density of green space that they have, that was enough to offset half of the carbon impact of the car emissions. And so that's pretty cool in terms of the prospects for the future. So that's great. But now what I want to then draw your attention to is that green space and all of the labor that's connected to it is not a straightforward proposition. So it's great when it works. It's great to have that Chicago approach, but it's just one example of a strategy. What I'll also point out with, for later on in this talk is that the big conversation that is happening is that for our ambitions around net zero, there's 100 ways to do it. Which ways are going to win? So the nature-based way, for example, is super appealing because it means that the little guy can participate. There's an alternative way, and I'm being very general here, but it's like, big, gigantic industrial carbon scrubbers is an alternative pathway. And with those pathways, what's not clear is that they're costly and they don't need any engagement from the side. And so if that becomes where we put our money, what does that mean in terms of equity and who is a part of the conversation? So if you take nothing else away from this conversation, it's that a lot of what we're having, whether it's on the political level or just in our grassroots from our community, there are bottom-up strategies that really show up in terms of making a difference for how people live. Because there are, in addition to any of the carbon mitigation impacts, that's separate from environmental impacts and workforce impacts. So where we end up will be, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I want to give you another example of what it looks like for bottom-up impact. So first example was around green space and stormwater management. This example is around, so I'm sure, I don't know how many of you have EVs, but you probably are very familiar with the EV conversation. So if we switch for the electrification of our transportation, if we have more EVs, there's a big impact on emissions, not just in general, but where I live. So I've been in the space working on environmental things for a long time. And I'm almost ashamed to admit, though, that what can happen is that you can forget about all of the different impacts, right? And the real things that are happening. I have a lot of friends who do a ton on air quality, but I wasn't thinking about it like a whole lot until recently. There are real impacts. One, I think, because of our consumption and need for fast delivery with Amazon, we have more and more warehouses that are being put up everywhere. As more and more warehouses are being put up, it means that trucks need to deliver to them. And the trucks that are delivering to them, if they're fossil fuel based, that has real local air quality implications. To the levels that more trucks mean more asthma for the kids that live in that neighborhood. And so one of the ways, and so I have here just some stats from the American Lung Association. It says that, the more that we can switch to EVs, then, that'd be like a 60% reduction in asthma and other cases. So last week I was in DC with Anna, and she lives in one of these neighborhoods that has, I think she's in Inland Empire, that particular area. So her story, though, is the one that made me think, oh my God, why haven't I thought more about this? I was like, I do all of these other things, but her story really just got me thinking about why does it have to be that, her kid has to get asthma before something else gets done. So with her story, so we were in DC last week with another organization called dream.org to do more federal lobbying and sharing these stories. But so Anna started as a teacher and running her own business. One day, her kid goes to the doctor and she finds out he has asthma. And then as she keeps going down the rabbit hole, it's not just her son. Half of the class has asthma. And then she digs some more and they're like, well, yeah, this asthma is kind of related to back to these trucks. And as the whole thing goes on, when you think about land use management, what gets approved is this vicious cycle of not being able to just keep up with how fast we need these Amazon packages. And so at the end of the day, so she ultimately joined this organization, but what she does now is she's an advocate for thinking about how to have better solutions around how will we balance our need for packages and consumption. We have to make a living. How can this not be to the detriment of other kids, like Anna's? And for sure, one of the things that would help is if we had more EVs and just lower pollution literally at the source. Let's see. So one other thing, I want to then maybe bring everybody back to, probably have all seen this charts like this. When we think about net zero and what we want to accomplish, so we have CO2 levels that keep rising, and the goal is to stabilize the levels that we're at right now. I have over here, I pulled just from another source, the scenarios have been done and projected out. If we do nothing, the levels of CO2 increase, and then that is what will, trigger some other increases in temperatures. So as I've been framing, then the question is, well, who's going to do what? What are these trade-offs going to look like as we now try to level out the CO2 emissions? So I have here an example from, this is just a Finnish NGO organization. I thought they did a really pretty, trade-offs picture, but it's a nice illustration. So for them, and for again, there are hundreds, depending on whether you're urban or rural, there are so many trade-offs that have to be made. And it's a trade-off because if you do one, you're not doing another. You're really making these intentional decisions that are reflecting your values, what you care about, what you want to prioritize. In this case, this Finnish organization, they're focused on agriculture and land use and how we think about that. When they think about their set of strategies for what they want to do, then I've not spoken, for example, about our dietary choices, for the urban use cases that I've given, but they're now very much focused on what we eat, right? What are we going to eat? What are we not going to eat? I wanted to then maybe highlight that you'll notice that from the land use to the diet-driven pathways, those are mostly, I would call them likely going to be bottom-up kinds of strategies. And then of course here they have, kind of pointed out again, this idea that there's now this technology-driven pathway. So an example that I wanted to give for the other side, direct air capture is an example of this big giant air scrubber option that you could do instead of planting trees and other things like that. And so what we don't know, and there's a lot of interest, a lot of venture funding is going to solutions like this as we move forward. And so what we don't know is, for the way that this will get implemented, what will it mean for how, who builds the technology? Where does it get installed? One of the big concerns that I have is that when we think about carbon math, one of the things that people are very comfortable with is that if I can reduce some carbon over here, then, as you were having this discussion earlier about having more energy efficient lab equipment, technically you could be like, I don't know if we want to do that. Let's just have somebody do some spot reductions of CO2 emissions elsewhere. I will call it a wash. We'll say that we're sustainable. We're going to keep the same lab equipment, and let's just get some carbon offsets. So this technology allows you to disassociate your actions directly with now, contributing to CO2 reductions. So if we think now about, so imagine as a lab, you have your sustainability ambitions, but you actually do nothing. Is that okay? I mean, you did buy the offsets. I mean, is that enough? So, but let's take it back to Anna and her kid. So if one of these warehouses wants to then say, look, I'm doing my due diligence for climate, right? I'm going to buy my offsets. But they have the same trucks that are coming in with the same impacts that will now lead to asthma. Is that fair? Is that right? Is that the kind of society that we want to have? So again, these are the discussions. And then just for your reference, these are, in terms of the ways that we are thinking about carbon removal, there's a nice study that summarizes this. And so the company that I featured, Noya, they are from the previous example, but direct capture is the approach that they're using. And so for what I mentioned earlier with stormwater, that's kind of a small nature. So anything less than an acre of green space is small, and forests are big. But these are the range of solutions that we're having this discussion around. So to wrap up, question is, where do we go from here? I think you can tell that I'm not a neutral actor. I'm in it for Darnell and Anna. I want the little guy to win because I think there are lots of upsides. But the decisions that we make about our climate strategies have real financial implications. And so I'm rooting for them. But I'm also rooting for more strategic partnerships. I would like it to be that if we have, really innovative ways to scrub the air, there's a whole value chain, that's connected to that. And perhaps there can be a win for Anna's air quality, challenge. So I think I'll just wrap it up there. But thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Kala. That was amazing. I'm inspired by Darnell's story.
Any questions? We have time for probably 2 questions.
I have a couple of questions. So you mentioned the EVs. So I have a couple of questions. You mentioned that EVs can help with the air pollution, but the problem is EV, lithium mining is troublesome. Plus, the battery only lasts 5 years, and moreover, the US only produce 20% of all the energy through renewables. So you are still using the fossil fuel for energy. You are just like replacing it with another delivery mechanism.
Yes, and that argument, is a real one. And I will do, I think, what the others do and say, well, it's step one of, I think a journey where there'll be, I think, more sustainable, processes get to the point of addressing the things that you raised.
Okay, and another thing is you mentioned Noya. So how do they raise the funds to build a carbon scrubber?
How did they get money?
Yes.
Oh, I mean, so do you know the whole technology startup? There are investors who believe in that approach and they put their money where their mouth is. Is that what you mean?
Yes, but then there's no rate of return on investment by the VC. So how is it even feasible in the large scale? Because I see a lot of these companies coming up, but when you think about what impact they're making, globally, it's negligible.
Well, so maybe you're thinking about like, I'm like positively reframing. So there's at least 2 kinds of impact, right? There's a numbers game to climate. You don't have to be in climate because you want to save the world or anyone, right? You can, there's a pure financial money game around climate because there's a target, right? And if you can show that you have a solution that gives a certain amount of gigatons at scale, people are going to use it, right? Companies for the ESG, corporates buy offsets, the ones that I sort of pointed out that are very, I find problematic, but it's a part of what's acceptable as a strategy. So if I look at the numbers game and where the money is in this whole thing, they're going to do big air scrubbers, okay? And people are going to get offsets from those scrubbers. It's a pure sort of numbers thing that works out if they can do it. But of course, there's a lot of, there are folks on the other side who have a lot of concerns about that approach. you know, as long as you can follow the money, like, you know, purely from that standpoint, you can get investment.
Okay, thanks.
I was just going to say the EV vehicle, the EV delivery vehicles make a ton of sense because it's really the density of the pollution that is the problem. So
and that's why I went very
the trucks
local
are there. The
to-
trucks are in your neighborhood. The trucks are in your community,
Yes.
whereas the power plant is probably like 40, 50 miles out of town.
Yeah.
So it's like your question, dilution is the solution to pollution. It's not the best solution, but it helps localize air quality. So
Yes. So because at a minimum, it's not, again, assuming that we're not going to stop getting those Amazon packages, there's a hunger, right, to kind of build out. I mean, and I think the thing that she pointed out is that they've been living in this spot forever, but in terms of land use regulations, they can't stop. They have not been able to stop warehouses getting approval to move into their communities. So now they've been there, and then all of a sudden, their trucks over on the other side of the street. And, you know, so assuming the warehouses are going to warehouse, we at least not have the air quality, you know, impacts that we know are going to come when they're there. I don't know if any of that is ideal. Anyways, but this is sort of the complexity of, you know, balancing commerce and our desires with people trying to just live.
Thank you, Dr. Kala Fleming. Wonderful. And you, round of applause, please. She has a wonderful TEDx talk if you research her on YouTube that I would highly recommend.